Richard Turley. We're very pleased to have Richard Turley speak for us today. He serves as Managing Director of the Family and Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His responsibilities include management of the Church Archives and Record Center, the Church History Library, the Museum of Church History and Art, and the Granite Mountain Records Vault. He is also responsible for the management of the Church's worldwide family history operations, including hundreds of documentary microfilming and digital imaging projects, oversight of the Family History Library, and support for the thousands of branch family history centers on 6 continents. He is the member of the editorial board for the Papers of Joseph Smith and general editor of the Journals of George Q. Cannon series. His book, Victims, the LDS Church and Mark Hoffman Case, which is through Urbana, is an oft-cited history of the famous Hoffman forgery murder case of the 1980s. Along with Ronald W. Walker and Glenn M. Leonard, he is currently writing a book on the Meadows Massacre that we published by Oxford University Press, and I'm sure he'll tell us when that will be released as well, right? So with that, we welcome Richard Turley.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge one other person. Barbara Jones Brown provided a tremendous amount of help in preparing this paper. I saw her slip in. Barbara, can you stand up and take a bow? I'm embarrassing her, but that's okay. She deserves it. In September 1857, in a highland valley in southern Utah known as the Mountain Meadows, 50 to 60 territorial militiamen, aided by American Indian allies, massacred some 120 California-bound immigrants. The militiamen were all Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The victims, many of whom were women and children, had been promised safe passage from their makeshift wagon fort to the nearby settlements of Pinto and Cedar City. Next month marks the 150th anniversary of this tragic event. Today, I would like to reflect upon the setting and causes of this tragedy. I have often called the Mountain Meadows Massacre the worst episode in Utah and Latter-day Saint history, though arguments could be made to the contrary. In January of 1863, for example, U.S. Army Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, then based near Salt Lake City, together with some 200 of his California volunteers, massacred about 250 Shoshone at a site that is now just north of the Utah-Idaho border, but was then presumed to be part of Utah territory. Once again, many of those killed were women and children. Sadly, these massacres are just 2 examples of many that occurred in the history of the American West. Even more tragic is the fact that mass killings are not a thing of the past. The most destructive century in world history may well be the one through which we have just passed. If you run a Google search of the term mass killing, you can quickly find on a Stanford University website a list titled "A Record of Misery: Mass Killing in the Past 5 Decades." It provides some 24 examples of events involving 100,000 or more human deaths. Elsewhere, Dr. Irvin Staub, a leading expert on mass killing, has written, "Genocides, mass killings, and other cruelties inflicted on groups of people have not ceased since the Second World War. Consider the millions killed by their own people in Cambodia and Indonesia, the killing of the Hutu in Burundi, the Igbo in Nigeria, the Aceh Indians in Paraguay, and the Buddhists in Tibet, and the mass killings in Uganda." Staub also mentions killings in Argentina, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Since Staub wrote these words in 1989, mass killings have continued. Kosovo, Rwanda, and the current situation in Darfur come to mind, for example. Perhaps one reason why the Mountain Meadows Massacre has not received more attention is that history offers vastly more destructive examples that overshadow it. In saying this, I do not wish to downplay or diminish the horrific nature of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, nor make us less conscious of the pain and suffering it caused the victims and has continued to cause their families and others for a century and a half. To the victim of any crime, pain and suffering do not diminish just because others in greater number have been victimized at another time or in another place. As Scott mentioned in the introduction, along with my colleagues Ronald W. Walker and Glenn M. Leonard, I've spent many years studying the massacre and its causes while writing a book titled Massacre at Mountain Meadows that will be published next year by Oxford University Press. In our research, we have examined the massacre from multiple perspectives in an effort to understand just how it happened and why. One aspect we have studied is the psychology of group violence in general. What we have discovered is that the Mountain Meadows Massacre is a classic case of mass killing as described by experts who have studied group violence in modern world history. To illustrate this conclusion, I will quote from two of Dr. Staub's books, The Roots of Evil, The Origins of Genocide and Other Group Violence, and The Psychology of Good and Evil, both of which books were published by Cambridge University Press. Then I will give corresponding examples from the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Staub's work comes from a growing body of scholarly literature on violence, including mass killings. A child survivor of the Holocaust, Staub is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, founding director of the PhD concentration in the Psychology of Peace and Prevention of Violence, and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Much of the recent violence literature discusses both genocide and mass killing. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a national, racial, political, or cultural group. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, of course, was not genocide, but it was a mass killing, which is defined as the act of murdering a large number of people, typically at the same time or over a relatively short period of time. Though experts describe many conditions and cultural characteristics that have contributed to mass killings throughout modern history, time constraints allow me to discuss only a few of them today. Of course, none of these factors of themselves result in mass killing. But when many of them exist simultaneously, the result can be deadly. Staub explains that all cultures possess some of these characteristics. The likelihood of group violence is greatest if a group possesses a constellation of the most essential ones. Staub also explains certain characteristics of a culture and the structure of a society, combined with great difficulties or hardships of life and social disorganization, are the starting point for mass killing. How did this factor relate to the Mountain Meadows Massacre? The pioneers of southern Utah faced a hardscrabble existence in the 1850s. In Cedar City, the nerve center of the massacre, workers in the community's principal economic venture, the iron works, had failed to come up with a viable process for producing usable iron from the region's plentiful ore, despite tremendous efforts to do so. These frustrating and repeated failures occurred among a people who were so poor that many went without shoes at the time. For years, local leader Isaac Haight discouraged trade with passing immigrants in part because he hoped those who had excess would share with those who were struggling to put food on the table. The region had also experienced social upheaval in the short few years of its settlement. During the 1853-1854 Walker War with Ute Indians, settlers tore down outlying settlements that they had worked hard to build and moved into what then became cramped quarters of a few central forts. At this time and in surrounding years, feuds in Cedar City and John D. Lee's Fort Harmony led many settlers to break off and form separate communities or to abandon Utah altogether. Turnover in leadership was also significant during this time. News of the approaching U.S. Army in 1857 only exacerbated tensions and concerns for survival. When life conditions prove difficult, people are more susceptible to group violence on a large scale. Staub writes, "Difficult life conditions give rise to powerful needs and goals demanding satisfaction. Hard times make people feel threatened and frustrated. Threats to the physical self are important, but so are threats to the psychological self. All human beings strive for a coherent and positive self-concept, a self-definition that provides continuity and guides one's life.